I'm a nature photographer. At least, that's my hobby. Nothing thrills me more than capturing the beauty of wildlife on camera. Like I said, it's mainly a hobby, but I try and take every professional opportunity I can. For example, entering contests. You could win big money, and that all goes towards upgrading my equipment, since if you know anything about photography, well, it's a very expensive hobby. This was the reason I was out in a small boat, off the coast of Maine, hoping to capture some whale pictures. It was just me and this older guy I'd chartered the boat from, who looked to be about 100 years old. He didn't talk much, but that was fine. I kind of enjoyed the quiet, honestly, all so I could concentrate better. He looked like some oldie-time mariner, and said to call him Captain. He'd been coming out here for decades and knew the best spots. We'd been out for a couple hours already, when I began to notice something odd. I've seen many unusual abnormalities in nature over the years. You don't necessarily need to believe in monsters once you've seen deformed calves or two-headed piglets. There's so many unusual and freakish creatures in the wild without needing to invent things to fit for a horror movie. I had already gotten some great pictures when I noticed a trail in the water. It looked like blood, and I wondered if there might be a shark. When people think of Maine, they conjure up whales and of course lobsters, but there are a lot of sharks. The captain had a gun with him, just in case, but I couldn't see the telltale fin sticking out of the water, and there didn't seem to be the usual mad panic when the other sea life senses a large predator. Then, I caught a flash of an unusual looking tail splash out of the water. It was unusual because it appeared rotten and skeletal, if that makes any sense. Reminded me of a cartoon fish bone, and the trail of blood was all around it. The captain didn't even seem remotely fazed, but then he didn't seem to have any sort of facial expression at all, besides mono. Maybe he'd seen this before. I tried to ask him, but he just grunted. Then, all of a sudden, there was a loud bang against the side of the boat, and I clearly saw more of the tail, which was just a rotten-looking and bony as the tip of it. That had seemed to have gotten the captain's attention, as now he made a conscious effort to steer the boat in a different direction. I was trying to take as many photos as I could. Have you ever seen that Disney movie about the mermaid? Well, whoever drew the main character, thank God they hadn't seen one of these, or it would have never been a family-friendly movie. In the water beside us was the most grotesque creature that I had ever laid my eyes on, from land or sea. It, and I will say it, rather than she or he, I refused to liken this hideous thing. It leered out of the water, scratching at the side of the boat. In that full moment, I got a good view of just how truly ugly, grotesque, and revolting it was. What had looked like fin rot covered the entire body. A long, thin, bony tail, covered in what appeared to be rotting meat, with bits of its skin and what had looked like fin rot, scales flapping, as if they would fall off. It honestly reminded me of a rotting fish. The tail ended around the waist and gave way to an equally skeletal body again, covered in what looked like diseased skin. I couldn't really exactly tell what it was. It looked kind of humanoid. Flapping skin, rotting skin I should say, with visible bones. And it had long, thin arms, with overly large hands. They were more like talons, or dagger-like claws. And all of this, if not ready, was topped with a head that appeared to be a very grotesque-looking skull. I mean, it wasn't a human skull. It was part animal, but I can't exactly make out. It had a grotesque-looking snout, and all sorts of nasty little details. I didn't see any eyes in the sockets, They were just two empty black holes. But it did have a huge maw filled with razor-sharp-looking teeth. Since I'm writing this to you, to share and to warn people of the dangers, I guess you can say what happened next. I was terrified, and as I believe I have every right to be, my grip on my camera lessened, and I lost my camera into the water. Down it went. There's $1,000 I'm out of. Once I'd managed to get up, I looked over the side, but the creature and of course my camera were now gone. I yelled at the captain that we needed to get back. Without hesitating further, we shot back to shore without saying anything. I was pretty shaken up by the whole thing, and of course really upset and utterly pissed about losing my $1,000 camera. Getting off the boat, the captain just looked at me and shook his head. You never hang about if you see one of them. Anyway, that's my experience with what I would call a merfolk, but I don't even know if that's exactly what I saw. The captain, as I said, seemed totally unfazed and would not even talk about it. What happened out there on the boat? I have no idea, but part of me believes it was some paranormal supernatural experience. Something from hell or the dead came to visit our boat. As for my camera, well, it took a little while, but I finally was able to replace it. I live on the coast in Cornwall in the UK. It is a place of beauty, and something I have never taken for granted. In fact, one of my favorite things to do is to take a long walk along the beach, especially early morning before the crowds begin to arrive. The sounds of the ocean is incredibly peaceful and gives this overwhelming sense of calm. Even if the waves are lashing, it still makes me feel good. In fact, sometimes when the sky is dark and the rain is hammering down and the waves are angry, those are my favorite times. And it was during one of these storms that I saw something very unusual in the water. I almost didn't go out. The rain was that heavy, but something drew me to the sea that morning, and because it was so early, I knew I could get home and have a hot shower before heading off to work. So I went. It was early and so wet that I could hardly see. The rain pelting against my skin in a way that it hurts. I remember thinking to myself that I must be mad, yet I felt strangely compelled to carry on. It was almost like there was this voice in my head. You must continue with this walk. Fighting against the rain and barely being able to see where the weather stopped and the sea began, I saw something moving in the water. Due to the visibility being nearly at zero, it was incredibly hard to determine what it was. But I saw that it was moving, and I knew whatever it was alive, and large, and ultimately shouldn't be there. I didn't get a really good look at it. It was impossible, and maybe that's what it wanted. All I can make out was a mass of what appeared to be tentacles, dozens and dozens of them, all writhing and bobbing up and down and out of the waves. It would be hard to say what color they were, but they did stand out clearly from the water, a dark, muddy sort of hue. I don't know if it made a noise. There's no way I could have heard anything over the rain and crashing waves. I stood there, mesmerized for several minutes. It reminded me in a way of a pit of snakes. Then, they just seemed to slither back away into the sea. As soon as they had retreated, I almost seemed to snap out of whatever weird daze I'd been in, and literally ran home to get these sodden clothes warmed up. Even after a shower, warm enough to scald my skin, I couldn't get warm. I just shivered the entire day, and the rain kept coming. Then, sometimes after work, the rain just stopped. 1 second, thrashing down in sheets. The next, nothing. I immediately warmed up after that. So much that I had to start ripping off many layers I'd worn, just to try and get some heat. The whole experience was just really weird. I don't know what I saw in the sea, but even more so, I don't know how it seemed to hold some sort of power over me. It was a very, very weird experience. Very strange. Perhaps the strangest I'd ever experienced. I work as a sea fisherman, catching various produce for a very large supermarket chain, and it isn't uncommon to find something other than fish in my net. I get all sorts of surprises, more and more nowadays. I guess it just shows all the stuff people dump in the sea does not just float to the bottom or rot away. What a shocker, I know. I often bring this extra stuff home and post photos on social media. A sort of look what you've done post. I don't know if it makes any difference, but I try to do my bit. I'm not writing this to you to be eco-friendly. I want to tell you, and hopefully your listeners, about the thing that got away. It was one of those regular working days where you're just on autopilot. You've been doing the job for so long. Many of you know what I'm talking about. Those who have jobs and careers that every day is pretty much the same old, mundane, drawn out. You almost don't even need to concentrate. Your body knows the patterns of what exactly to do. As soon as I was heaving the nets in and out with the day's catch, I almost failed to notice my potential stowaway. Alongside all the garbage that turns up. Again, it isn't unusual to get a visitor. I only catch fish, other guys handle the crustaceans. So, if I pick up a lobster, crab, squid, he goes back into the sea. Sometimes, though, I've catch a weird-looking thing. I truly believe we have no idea what lives in the vast oceans, and there are hundreds, if not thousands of species we'll probably never discover. And just maybe, it was one of those that I caught that day. It would also be fitting to have come from any sci-fi or alien movie. So as I was emptying out the net, I saw something shoot out and scuttle across the boat. My first thought didn't go to alien, sea monster. I thought it must be a crab or lobster. I'd only had a fleeting glance as it shot off, but I did notice it left a sludgy black trail. It might be ink, I thought, or maybe a kind of squid. Whatever it was, it needed to go back into the ocean. I followed the trail over to the very darkest corner of the boat, and I could see it had several eyes looking at me. I was genuinely curious at this point. I called to it, hoping it would respond to me. If anybody had seen it, I'm not sure if it would have looked like a scene from a horror movie. This thing leapt out, tried to attach itself to me, and I managed to grapple it just in time. The best way to describe it is it looked somewhat like a giant scorpion-esque lobster-type crab with too many eyes and nasty vicious pincers and a really long stinging tail. It opened its mouth like a sandworm, and its head almost disappeared as the mouth was so wide, and it screamed and I threw it back into the sea. That description doesn't do it justice, but it's the best I can do. It also left some of that black sludge all down me, and I spent the next few days violently throwing up. I honestly think that it had some kind of low-dosage poison in its system. I don't know what it was, but if I get another in my net, I'm quitting. I rarely drink, and I have never taken any kind of illegal drug. I do feel the need to clarify that before I tell this story, as it seems so unbelievable. You know how sometimes you see something that isn't quite right, but you just can't quite put your finger on it. You stare and think that it isn't right, but your mind won't quite process what the odd thing is. This happened to me one day as I was driving through this huge forest of trees. It was a pretty decent road, but all you could see for miles and miles were just trees. Then, there would be a gap for about a mile of just fields, and then more and more trees, for miles. There were signs on the road to look out for deer and any other forest inhabitant that might decide to jump out in front of you. I was being cautious. Sure enough, I see a deer in the tree line, which is in no way remarkable or unusual. Except, this deer seemed to be moving in an odd fashion. Needing to keep my eyes on the road, I couldn't just stare at it, but there was something weird, something nagging me. It followed alongside the trees for quite some time, and this began to ring alarm bells. Shouldn't it be tiring? How fast did deer run? It was coming up to one of the stretches where the trees seemed to disappear for a short time, and there was just great swaths of grassland before more trees. Just as the deer passed the last tree and ran out onto the grass, it struck me what was up with it. The legs didn't appear to look right. Rather than that super skinny Bambi-esque wobbly legs, these were stronger and reminded me of canine legs. What happened next afterwards seems like something out of a Hollywood movie. As the deer continued running, I kid you not, it began to change. Right before my very eyes as I was driving along, and how I didn't crash, I don't know. There was no way at the time I was looking at the road. Here you go. This deer began to turn into a wolf. The transformation seemed to only take a mere few seconds, and there it was, a wolf. No sign of the deer anywhere. There's nothing else around, and just this one creature that had literally changed from one animal to something completely different. It gave a sort of weird high-pitched howl that sounded not normal, and then ran off even faster than the car into the next set of trees. I floored it, not to try to catch up with it, but to get as far away as possible. I had no idea exactly what it was that I saw, and I didn't want to know. I had recently received the news that my grandmother was sick with COVID. This was a big blow for me, since I was close to my grandmother, and I had fallen into a slump where I had not contacted her, just for the sake of it, for a very long time. So other than the distress of finding out that she was ill, the experience was compounded by the guilt of knowing that I hadn't been keeping in touch, and that she might not be around much longer. I went for a walk on a lonely bike trail that ran through thick woods. The outdoors was always good for me, a place of solace. It was the sort of thing that evened me out and allowed me to think from a relaxed and level-headed perspective. The trail was wide, and it was raised up so that either side sloped down to the woods, kind of like a road, where there is small ditches on each side of the road to help shear off rainwater. I didn't do much observing of the scenery, though. My eyes were mostly kept to the trail and my feet as I tried to sort out thoughts and emotions. I heard a snap of a twig off to the side. It garnered my attention, so I looked into the woods to see that just behind the first line of trees, a large buck, looking at me inquisitively. If it had been a person, I would have been irritated at my inner dialogue being interrupted. I easily admired the beauty of the creature for a long time before continuing on, absorbing into my thoughts with a lighter heart. I quickly thanked this buck for the mood lift. Walking along, I quickly threw glances over my shoulder to make sure if my animal companion was still there. It was still looking at me, as it was trailing me at a distance. Maybe I was in its territory, but it didn't seem like it was going to charge me or anything. One of the times that I looked back, I did so just in time to see it go behind one tree, and then see a large coyote emerge from behind the same tree. That made me stop and stare. Why had the deer gotten so close to a coyote? And how come the coyote hadn't attacked the deer? I quickly scanned the tree line for the buck, but it was gone. It was as if the buck had transformed, which was impossible. But the coyote behaved exactly as the deer had. Right then in that moment, I began to get a sickening, sinking feeling in the pit of my stomach. I kept looking back at the coyote, and it went behind a tree and emerged as a fox. When I stared directly at it, it would just stand there and stare back at me, almost behaving identical to the past two animals. But when I walked on and only minded it out of the corner of my eye, it would follow and perform these inexplicable transformations behind trees, out of sight. The final straw for me was when it emerged from behind one of the trees as my very own grandmother. The imitation, or so I call it, was perfect. Even the way she walked. She even yelled out to me with her voice. That voice that I knew so well. I began to run. I knew it wasn't right. Something was wrong. When I looked behind me, my grandmother had transformed into something like a wolf made of pure black shadow. Panic came over me, and I ran in that moment for all I was worth. I was thoroughly winded. It took me a while to recover, and I'm still waiting to hear if my grandmother is going to make it through or not. But I know whatever I saw that day, it wasn't her. I don't know if it was some kind of omen. It was just a product of all the stress I was under. I'm not sure. But if I ever see it again, I'm not going to wait around to see if it's an hallucination or not. By the way, as far as it being a native thing, or some sort of black magic, the only thing I can attribute to that is there's a reservation nearly 30 miles away from here. I have no idea if the two coincide. I will never forget the time I was walking home from my girlfriend's house one day when I was at high school and saw something that should never have been possible. It was a dark and cold evening, since it was late fall, and I was doing a sort of fast walk jog to move and try to get home faster. My hands were shoved into my pockets. It was freezing. I had to walk through the play park and jungle gym area that is behind houses. You have to be careful, as there's also a lot of stray dogs. Unfortunately, owners around there weren't very responsible. Now, when I first saw the dog, it wasn't exactly a shock, even though I couldn't see its owner. Still, a dog in a park. Not surprising. I carried on, and now this dog began to follow me. Something was different though about this dog. The eyes were strange, and it kept following me. There were still no signs of the owner, no one calling out. I shouted to it, "Go home." I was beginning to feel weird and awkward. Why was it following me? I was nearly home, and it still followed me, and this odd sense kept growing and growing. So, I stop before I get to my street. It stops too, looks at me. I can see now clearly what was bothering me. This dog had very bright, intelligent blue eyes. They didn't exactly look like dog eyes. Not like blue eyes you'd see in Alaskan Malamute or a husky. Not like that. Now bear with me. They were human-like. Suddenly, there was a loud noise that startled me, and I turned to see a car coming down the road, blaring loud music. I quickly turned my attention back to the dog, but the dog was now gone. Since this road was straight, I couldn't see or rationalize how it could have disappeared, at least without a trace. Then, I caught a slight movement out of the corner of my eye, close to the wall that was next to the sidewalk by the houses, and out of the shadows stepped a man. A man who had very much not been there a minute or two before. That had no way of just appearing any more than the dog could have just disappeared. And as I saw him more clearly, he had the brightest blue intelligent-looking eyes, exactly like that dog. I didn't care about not going home or following. I was so scared, I ran. I didn't hear any footsteps follow behind me, and once I got home, I allowed myself to think about it. It couldn't be true. It seemed as though I had been followed by a dog who turned into a man. Does that even happen? Was he what they call a shapeshifter? And if so, had I been targeted, or was he merely just curious? My aunt and uncle hosted the family reunion every year. They were young enough to do it, and they certainly had the living space to. We were not a small family by any measure, so when it was time for the reunion, their backyard, as you can imagine, was packed. Having the woods at the edge of their property added a nice touch to the whole experience. This last year was the Lua theme, so there were tiki torches and loud Hawaiian shirts aplenty. My aunt being the social butterfly, and my uncle was just a little bit, but not anywhere near that level. Any breathing she did was just enough so she could take another breath and keep talking and laughing. And of course, her nosy Pomeranian, Lucky, had somehow uprooted his leash and bolted for the woodline. My aunt was quick enough to see him do it, but not fast enough to catch him before he went behind the trees. All of us got a good look at my aunt running, like she's in a marathon. She came back after a few minutes with Lucky in her arms, and he just wasn't having it. She was surprisingly very quiet for the rest of the evening. Several people, including myself, wondered if there's something wrong. She had that look like you would expect from somebody who's upset. But, like a lot of people, she insisted that she was fine. She didn't even play any games until she was invited, and when she participated, she said nothing, and not even smiling. Now, my uncle was visibly embarrassed that his wife would be this upset with him about something in front of the entire family, but when he pressed her about it, she would shrug her shoulders and claim to be okay. She was just tired. My uncle knew better. I mean, the poor man was driven to a sort of quiet desperation to get his wife to stop treating him like this, and yet she told him there wasn't any behavior to cease. The awkwardness wouldn't leave, but my uncle resigned himself to things being what they were. Everybody started moving inside so that they could enjoy a little more time together in the backyard before everybody went home. If I had not lingered in the backyard, I would have not noticed the movement at the tree line. Somebody was out there, and I recognized it right away, but I had no explanation. My aunt was hobbling out of the woods as if she was injured. I ran up to her, asked her what was going on. She explained that when she went after Lucky, somebody had shoved her down and grabbed him and ran off. She was planning on going inside and calling the police to report the dog as missing. That's when my blood ran cold, when I calculated all the implications. Though injured, my aunt was still managing to talk up a storm. Whoever it was that went inside with my uncle was the total opposite. I helped her inside the house, but I chose not to tell her about the doppelganger. I searched the house as discreetly as possible. There was no sign of the other aunt. I told my uncle that was going on, and he helped me comb through the house, because he swore that twin day his wife had just been there. But she was gone when he turned around. She had either mysteriously vanished or was hiding. Well, they never found her, and we never saw her again after that. So, shapeshifter, skinwalker, wendigo, or doppelganger, let's never meet again. This experience was shared with me by my own aunt. She's not somebody who is predisposed to flights of fancy. She's generally a strict materialist, very rational, and very straightforward thinking. So, when she says that she experienced anything unusual, people around her generally sit up and pay attention. The reaction she pulled with the story was no different. She was out seeing to the cattle on their remote ranch on a very quiet afternoon, like any other. The only thing that seemed out of the ordinary at the time was how still everything was. No breeze, no chattering of animals. The classic scenario of quiet, but too quiet. She didn't pay it that much mind, and she just casually went about her business of putting out feed for the cows. The sky at the time was heavily overcast, and the sounds that my aunt began to hear nearly sounded like thunder, except it never stopped rumbling. If anything, it got louder as it continued. It grew to the point where the cows were beginning to get agitated, and my aunt began to be afraid that she might get trampled if they got any more excited. The color of the overcast clouds began to change before her very eyes, transitioning to a sort of muddy green, and the expansive sky directly overhead was beginning to move, to churn. The air was also growing perceptibly warmer, and then with a sudden blast, the clouds opened up to reveal a great massive shape in the form of a diamond. There appeared to be lights all over it, with one great central glowing mass that seemed to be the main source of heat. And by the time this thing was visible, it was extremely hot, according to my aunt. The smell of burning hair filled the air, as this massive UFO just hung in the sky, low, blasting the area with a searing wind. It did gradually withdraw, too slow for my aunt. When it was gone, she realized that a large portion of her hair had actually fallen out, and a good number of cows were on the ground with shallow breathing. Every rational thinker would know. Her first instinct was to get a hold of somebody in the US government to know why one of their experimental craft had just irradiated her and her cattle. It took her a while, but she was able to make the right phone calls to reach the right people. The government apparently took no responsibility for any such aircraft. My aunt has a very loud voice, and I don't mean that literally. She called and called until news crews were at her house, and even local governments had to respond. FBI agents, however, were dispatched to investigate Ground Zero, and they were unable to come up with any explanation other than what my aunt described as happening. To this day, she is pretty reluctant to say anything along the lines of that she was visited by a ship from outer space. She somehow clings to the notion that it was the property of some organization here on Earth, and that there's no way it came from anywhere other than this planet. Me, my aunt's story is one of the reasons I'm a believer. And by the way, this happened back in 1997. I was on a lonely road in the Arizona desert, and I was busy riding my motorbike. I was enjoying the relative solitude and seeing just how fast my bike could go. Something caught my attention out of the corner of my eye for just a split second. I thought it was the moon. It was just the right size and shape, but it was definitely inside the Earth's atmosphere. A spherical white metallic object was in the flight, heading the same direction that I was going. When I realized that it wasn't the moon, I had to stop my bike to get a closer look, and when I stopped moving, it stopped moving. It did not make any loud noises, although I did think there was some sort of low electronic hum that was omnipresent. The craft was void of any major details, except some indentations along the top that allowed me to see that it was rotating on a vertical axis. gauging size and distance is difficult in the landscape of the desert, so I'm afraid to make estimations. I was under the impression at the time that it was at least the size of a car, but that seemed to change throughout the entire encounter. Even my emotions were difficult to spell out. I wasn't terrified, but I certainly didn't feel comfortable, and I could not shake the feeling that the thing was staring at me the same way I was staring at it. I couldn't tell if it was a vessel, like an aircraft, or if it was something more like a drone. There were no markings to indicate whether it came from the US or otherwise, and I had heard all the rumors of how Arizona was supposedly the perfect place to test experimental aircraft. I worked up the nerve to even wave at it. So I rode on my way, receiving no response, and I noticed that the spherical craft was matching my speed perfectly. I won't lie, it definitely made me nervous. I stopped to look at it once again, and it also stopped. There was no questioning it at this point. I was being followed. I didn't linger like it did the first stop. I got right on moving, hoping that it would eventually give up. It followed me for at least another 2 minutes, and then it took off with blinding speed. That's when I breathed a little sigh of relief, and I continued on my way until I came to a rest stop. I went in to use the bathroom, and it looked like I was the only person there, so the place was incredibly quiet. It was one of those setups where there was a men's room and a woman's room, and some water fountains, and a stand with a bunch of travel brochures, and a few severely overpriced vending machines. I was finishing up my visit with a drink of water when I became aware of a vibration in the floor. It rose to the level of quaking, and the water fountain was actually rattling. Naturally, my first thought was that there was some sort of quake, so I got out of the rest stop as quickly as I could. And now, I saw that same spherical craft that had followed me on my bike. It was now directly overhead the rest stop. Here, its size seemed to change, and it looked to be the size of a small hot air balloon. Although the ground was gently shaking, and the loud electronic humming was very intense. It was easier to see the thing that was indeed rotating, and it appeared to hover in place perfectly. Since I had emerged from the rest stop, the craft moved so that it was directly over me. I instantly felt like I was in one of those vibrating massage chairs. I also found that I couldn't run because my feet were suspended several inches off the ground. I thought for sure in that moment I was going to be the subject of many urban legends where the human or the cow was sucked up into a spaceship. But I wasn't. I was just held there in the air for a short while. At the time, it felt like a lifetime. I was just a short step away from panicking. Then, my feet were touching the ground again, and the craft ascended upward in a perfectly straight line, almost instantaneously. It's easy to speculate that it was a visitor from another world, but I emphasize that it had no markings and no lights. I'm a little paranoid when I go riding my bike these days, but I never saw that same thing again since. The story that I'm about to share with you might be more common if people were more in the habit of looking up. See, I've been obsessed with astronomy since I was just a child, and I've also been equally obsessed with the celestial phenomena. So if I'm outside, my eyes are always up. You wouldn't believe some of the things that you could see in the sky if you would just pay attention. I was busy setting up my telescope for a very rare event where Saturn would be only bigger and brighter than it had been in the last 200 years. And not only that, the light would be at the perfect angle so that the rings would be the clearest that they've been through a telescope for a very long time. Even with the naked eye, Saturn was dominating the sky, much the way Venus usually does. I looked up at it admiringly, when I noticed something unusual. There was a planet or a star there that I couldn't place just underneath Saturn. I have stared at charts long enough to know that this was definitely out of place. I was about to reach for my telescope when the star began to slowly circle Saturn. It dawned on me that whatever it was actually much closer than I had thought, as in within the Earth's atmosphere. It had circled several times, and then stopped at about the 12 o'clock position. And while that light held its position, another light appeared at 4 o'clock, and then both lights continued to circle around in Saturn, clockwise motion. This lasted for several cycles before the lights held still, with one of them at the 12 o'clock position above Saturn, and the other at the 4 o'clock position. And that's when a third light appeared in the 8 o'clock position. All three lights circled around Saturn for several cycles. I looked around to make sure that I wasn't simply seeing the reflection of any light. But no. Those lights were definitely in the sky, and they were circling Saturn in a Y-shaped formation, or a triangular formation. While I was gaping up at the sky, trying to make sense of what I was seeing, all three lights suddenly held their position and began to grow brighter. I saw that it was because they were getting closer, and I was torn between wonder and terror. After all the times that I could only suspect that I was witnessing intelligent phenomena, here was an instance of it that was clearly undeniable. The lights were impossible to size up. I couldn't tell if they were mounted on a craft, or if the lights were crafts themselves. A sound like amplified static reverberated throughout the entire sky, and as the lights neared the surface, they appeared to hold their position one last time and then sped off to the northern horizon at a breakneck speed. If there was a message in that visit, it went completely over my head. If it was for somebody else, maybe the angle of the other witnesses would have put Saturn at the center of the formation. If it was for me at all, I'm still just as clueless. If it weren't for the sheer speed and agility and maneuvers of the lights, I could easily write them off as man-made aircraft. But I don't think our country has anything that could stop on a dime like that. It literally defied physics and gravity. Anyway, hopefully some of your listeners can share ideas on what a rotating triangle formation could signify, let alone the fact that it involved Saturn. My dog can be a bit of a booger sometimes, and likes nothing better than to run off into the wilderness and either come across something way bigger than him, like a deer, so I have to chase after him before he gets his royal butt kicked, or dive into the muddiest, grossest bog he can find. Seriously, this is not unusual behavior at all, yet he's so energetic. He does need plenty of exercise, and like most, he's a total sucker for attention. Since on this day, it had been fairly dry, I was hopeful that the woods that we went to play in wouldn't have any surprises that would leave him dirty and covered in filth. I let him off the leash and go wild for a bit, as I usually do. Like most modern-day people, I was busy scrolling on my phone when I heard him making this terrible whining noise. He was coming from the trees, and then I heard an equally high, awful pitch sort of scream. I ran over, as I legitimately thought it was a child screaming. At least that's what it sounded like. I was just imagining seeing my dog on the floor, and some kind of kid screaming at him. For some reason, he is scared of kids. I don't exactly know why. But when I rush in, I could see my boy cowering and whining on the ground, but there was no child. Weird, I thought. Then I hear that awful scream again, from the trees behind me. Now I'm frightened, but also, what sort of person doesn't check to see why a kid might be screaming? If they are hurt, and I just walked away. I had to check, My dog wouldn't budge. He was terrified. So, I head over to the tree myself. That's when I hear movement, and then I see something shifting in the shadows. It was definitely not a kid. I couldn't even tell you what it was, because even though it was standing there, right in front of me, my eyes didn't want to believe it. It looked like some kind of wolf, only it was as tall as me and stood firmly on two legs, like a person, and not like when my dog begs for treats. This standing upright wolf looked like just how it was meant to be, except it was gross looking, mangy, matted fur, and I could see patches of ribs through its skin. And yet, unbelievably, this thing was extremely tall. You see, despite having the face like a wolf, it was also part human. I realize that probably doesn't make sense, but how does any of this does? It was like somebody had a photo of a wolf face, and then put a photo of a human face over it, and blended them together. The most unnerving part of the whole thing was that its eyes were very much like a human. If it was pitch black, and you could only see the eyes, you would have actually thought it was a person standing there. And all of a sudden, my dog displayed an unheard act of bravery, and began growling, barking, going crazy in my defense, came off the ground and ran over to this thing in total attack mode. It looked down at this barking, snapping dog and let out this terrible, distorted girl scream and seemingly vanished. It moved faster than the speed of light. One moment there, the next, it was gone. Thank God my dog didn't have another fit of bravery and began chasing after it. I'm not too sure I could have honestly coped with that, especially considering having something bad happen to my dog. I knew I never wanted to see that thing again, for as long as I lived. And just a few minutes later, once I'd gotten my wits back and was ready to head back home, I thought I could hear my dog in the trees. So I did a double take and looked down. But there he was, head cocked to one side, looking just as perplexed as me. We could both clearly hear a barking coming from the woods in the direction that thing had pelted off to, sounding just like him, but the pitch was wavering, and it sounded like it was going through an old AM radio. Very off and distorted sounding. It was creepy. Whatever that thing was could somehow copy voices and sounds. Is that something it can do, to lure you into the woods, thinking you could hear something or somebody you know? Well, that was enough for the both of us. We ran back to the car and headed home. As we passed by some more wooded areas and parks, I just remembered that some of the land around here used to be on reservation, before it was relocated and became major parks and woods. I had a buddy I work with whose great-grandparents lived on the original reservation around here. Could that somehow, in any way, be connected to what we saw? A few years ago, a buddy and mine were hunting when we came across something that to this very day, neither of us have been able to properly explain, and we will never forget. We hunted for the thrill, but also to put meat on the table. Deer and wild turkey, that kind of thing. And no, I'm not talking about the booze. We weren't really into trophy kills or tracking. If we saw a bear or a wolf, and one they tried to attack, we'd have no problems defending ourselves and putting it down. But ultimately, we respected larger predators. So, the day we came across a giant wolf was real and very frightening. We had been to that particular spot many times before, and my own buddy used to joke that sometimes it felt a bit spooky. We know the story of the land, that it had belonged to a Native American long before turning into several unabandoned woods. We also knew the rumors that there was a burial ground over the far end of the woods, which was marked by several large boulders. We never went there. Again, it's all about respect. I guess long ago, there used to be a large native village around here, which was connected to the burial ground, but we're talking hundreds of years ago. Since had been leveled and taken, and who owned it, I'm not quite sure. For whatever reason, family, work, just life in general, it had been quite a few months since we'd be able to get together and head to this place. Apparently, there had been a few strange occurrences in these same woods. A park ranger had found on several occasions a deer which had been ripped apart, but no signs of any wolves or any other large predators. No signs of a cadaver being eaten on. They just concluded a wild dog must have somehow escaped and was hiding somewhere. Since we had guns, they told us to be wary. Animals hadn't been spotted, and it was very unlikely that we would come face to face with it. Well, bad luck must have been on our side that day. We'd been there maybe a couple of hours when my buddy started to get that spooky feeling again. I just put it down to what the ranger had said, and him being a bit paranoid. It was putting both of us off, though, as we'd found a couple of easy doe, but both of us missing our shots. I'd spotted a real beauty that would feed my family for quite some time, but it was closer to those boulders than we'd ever seen before. My buddy was looking like he'd seen a ghost, all wide-eyed and pale. Then he turned to me and said we gotta go. He was freaking out, and then all of a sudden, around us became cold and dark, and we heard growling. We both instantly raised our guns, and then we saw it. I'd say it was a wolf, but it was so large. It was more like a werewolf, but instead of being all powerful, this thing looked really emaciated, skinny, and was kind of hunched over. Without any sort of hesitation, we both fired a ton of bullets. We didn't care what it was. We were so terrified. The thing that should have been filled full of holes knocked down dead within seconds, but it just stood there, taking the shots and not even flinching. We didn't even notice any bullet holes in it, as if this thing was translucent. And then, it did something even more disturbing. It casually got up from that crouching position, walking off on two legs. Not a drop of blood came from it. We didn't know what to think. We needed to get out of there. When we got back, we had casually seen the park ranger, what we had saw, trying to downplay it as to not scare him or us. He gave us a look as if he knew better, but even he couldn't admit. He nodded and said we must have seen the wild dog, and something just missed every shot. Anyway, we still don't know what that thing was, but it wasn't a regular wolf, that's for sure. Just everything about it was so wrong. I can tell you now from this experience, we're never going back out to that area, ever again. One of the most unnerving things that has ever happened to me was when I was on a family camping trip many years ago. I was around 12 at the time and had two younger siblings. One was only a baby, and the other less than 2. Since doing anything much with two babies in tow was pretty tough, camping seemed to be an easy option, and my parents had found a site that also had an actual summer camp attached, so there were always plenty of activities to get involved in. Since I was quite a bit older, they were happy to let me go off on my own. The baby never left my mother's side, but my not yet 2-year-old sister was a wanderer, and my dad always chasing after her. She also had this ear-piercing shriek that she found hilarious and would make for any sort of communication. One evening, I was walking back from the lodge quite later through the woods, as there had been a cookout, and my parents had given me permission as long as I was to come straight back afterwards. I'm walking back through the woods, and keep in mind, this is around 89, 88, so no cell phones or anything, and I hear this loud shriek, but it's coming from deeper in the woods, in the opposite direction of the tents. I call out. I hear another shriek, and another. I figured my little sister would be in trouble, but I couldn't see her, and I was starting to get scared. I raced back to the tent and went flying in, only to find all four of them all snuggled up. I told them what had happened, and of course they thought maybe another child was missing, so my dad went and reported it. Apparently, nobody was missing, which was a huge relief, but did not explain what I'd heard. The other strange thing was that my little sister was really sick in the night too. She got a really high temperature, and we had to pack up and go home early the next morning, just so my mother could take her to the doctors. But once we were on the road, she began feeling much better, and by the time we'd gotten home, she was right as rain. I will never know what I heard in those woods, or why my little sister was suddenly sick, and then suddenly fine again. But I have heard stories of creatures who can apparently mimic voices and drain the energy and make those they have copied very sick. I believe they're called Skinwalkers. Do you know anything about them? The fraternity I was accepted into had a slightly different hazing ritual than most. I had to join some of them in the use of a Ouija board. At least it wasn't as bad as what happened to the other kid, just a short distance away, that was forced to drink an entire fifth of vodka, and God only knows how much beer and wine. People are still talking about it. So yeah, my hazing would still involve spirits, just not the kind you would expect. I'm not sure if they were trying to be tongue-in-cheek, or if they thought I spooked easily, because everybody involved, 4 of them, and 1 being me, they were wearing long dark hooded robes that had obviously been Halloween costumes. I was preparing to give them the most disappointing hazing seance they had ever had. I'm one of those people that will never be superstitious. You could perform the bloodiest exorcism right in front of me, and I'd still think there's a way to rationally explain all of it, because there always is. As I said, there were 5 of us, which was by design. We sat in the middle of somebody's dorm room on a large throw rug that had a giant pentagram on it. We each sat on a point of the pentagram. All sorts of candles were lit, and lights were turned off, and it was time for their little scare stunt to backfire. They attempted to conjure up a spirit, and got through introductions. They said its name was Arnatikos. They threw cliched questions at Arnie, and I waited patiently. I think they were expecting me to get creeped out, because they all kept looking at me, and I made it a point to look as excited as a stoned paperweight. Finally, my rite of passage came to the point where I had to ask Arnie myself some questions. That was the moment I had been waiting for, the chance to put a few bullet holes in their seance. I proposed a yes or no question. Did I leave the window next to my bed in my dorm open? The planchet went to no, and so I smiled. I had indeed left it open. Then, I asked Arnie if I was going to be in college for more than 2 years. It answered no. Wrong again. I asked Arnie about the color of my car, my relationship status, a bunch of yes or no questions, and it got every single one wrong. It didn't tell the group what I was up to. Then, I began asking obvious questions. Were there 5 of us seated around the board? It kept answering no. This puzzled me. The answer should have been an obvious yes. I asked if there was anybody in the room that was alive. It answered no. The others were now looking just as confused as I did. I asked several more brutally obvious questions, and the board answered all of them wrong. Remember, I hadn't told anybody that the board had gotten all the previous questions wrong as well, the ones that only I knew the answers to. The logic and rational thinking that I swore by was starting to tighten around me like a python. The board was lying. It must have been obvious that I was getting freaked, because one of the guys at the board got a satisfied look about him when he began studying my face thoroughly, even though he too was anxious. I told him about my earlier questions, about how the board hadn't answered a single one of them correctly. My alarm became contagious, and the session was hastily but appropriately concluded. Later on up, I hit up Google to do some research on Arnie. I was expecting to find someone that was famous for being a compulsive liar. Turned out that the Arnitikos wasn't a name at all. It was the Greek word for negative. The new connections made my stomach sink into a bottomless pit of dread. The answers were the negatives, the mirrored versions of the correct ones. I still don't believe in spooks, but I will say that you'll never see me at a Ouija board again anytime soon in the future. A while back, I used to run with a really dark crowd. Dark, as in frequent use of heroin, drugs, making a living of selling off said street drugs, and not discriminating between a business deal with an adult and a business deal with children that had gotten taste for the stuff. People having a way of disappearing when they didn't pay off their tab. You get the picture. That used to be my life. You only cared about how bad of a life you were living in between fixes. When you were experiencing the fix, and when you were focused on getting the next fix, you didn't really care about much. Myself and about 10 others had formed something of a little cooperative. We weren't exactly a gang. Maybe we were something like a loosely organized company, or a guild, as nerdy as that sounds. But between all of us, we ran a good business, where there was enough cash flow to keep all of us feeding our addictions. If there is something sensational on the street, we get to it and try it. This doesn't mean things are always great. Drugs are drugs, no matter how close you get to people. But despite all the drama and discord that came with abusing substances, we managed to continue to work together. My personal wake-up call came with the arrival of some new big thing, and it wasn't a substance. One of the girls in our group was carrying on about how she had discovered the most amazing high she ever had, and this high was just as intense the 10th time as it was the first. If you've ever gone down the road of hard drugs, you're always chasing after that first high. So, the idea of such a thing intrigued the entire cooperative. Everybody tried it together, except for me, because just by coincidence, when they were trying whatever it was, I was out, quote-unquote, taking care of business. It wasn't until the 5th or 6th time they were going to get this new great high that I was finally able to join. Everybody was excited to see me experience it. There's something about the spirit among them that bothered me. It almost felt like an initiation into some strange religion. I mean, they really were together in this. It used to be that when we all got high, some people went off by themselves. This was a group experience. I was taken into one of the rooms where candles had been lit, and I fought off a wave of anxiety, but I couldn't fight off the strange chill that was in the room. The air felt like it was ionized, and every hair on my body stood on end. Everybody gathered around a board that at the time was only vaguely recognizable as a Ouija board. I mean, I've only ever seen such a thing like 3 times in my life. They began talking to somebody in the board named Z. A bunch of them had their hands on that strange little plastic thing that slides around the board. Several times, I thought that it was sliding around by itself, and their hands were just hovering above it, but that could not have been possible. And then, as if on cue, everyone turned their heads upward to the ceiling. This euphoric warmth began to spread all throughout my body. It was the eeriest thing I had ever experienced, and yet strangely the most intoxicating. I made the mistake of opening my eyes to look around. All of my friends had their eyes rolled back into their heads, and what looked like saliva with blood running out of the corners of their mouths and staining their clothes. I wanted to leave, but this invisible force prevented me. That didn't help. I fought it as much as I could, but the force anchored me in place, and the more I resisted, the stronger the force became, until I felt like I was being constricted. After much too long, the session ended, and everybody came to, looking satisfied. I left the cooperative that night, and I had a feeling that I should do so without announcing it. I won't lie, it was an intense pleasure, the euphoria that Z gave us. But there was something about the whole thing that felt like rape, and it put my lifestyle into very stark perspective. I don't have time to launch into all the ways of how this was done. Suffice to say that I've cleaned up my life from hard drugs and strange spirit entities. My sister is 14 years old, and she used to be the life of the party. Clever, smart, witty, pretty, and popular. Family loved her, tons of great friends. Teachers always thought she was a great kid too, until a few months back. She used to be very pretty. People would always mention it. Where she was slim, she was still very much a blossoming young woman. Now, she looks like a walking skeleton. Hangless hair, lifeless, greasy. You could put your shopping in the bags under her eyes. She stinks of cigarettes. And yes, she's only 14. The entire reason this happened was because she was stupid enough to fool around with a Ouija board. And, unlike the fake stories where people push around the planchet and make stupid spooky sounds, it knows that I really fancy Tony when she messed about with it. She won't tell me what she asked it, won't tell me how it got out. Of course, she had to do it alone, and in the house. I know it sounds harsh, but you should see her. I knew something had happened the day she did it. We were home alone that night. I'm 17, so my mom and dad trusted us. Trusted us, past tense. Now, they won't let us out of sight, except for school. She'd been really secretive, and I knew she was up to something. To be honest, I thought it would involve a boy. Whether she was FaceTiming somebody or planning to sneak out, I wasn't sure. She kept her door firmly shut, but I kept checking on her, pretending to offer her a drink, see if she was cold and needed the heat on. All sorts of excuses to see if she would talk to anybody. But each time I listened at the door and then barged in, she was alone. No phone, no laptop, no tablet, nothing. That was suspicious. Then she announced she had a slight headache and was going to sleep early. At 10 p.m., that's not like her. Again, I kept sneaking up to her door in silence. So, I Netflixed, and just before midnight, decided to hit the sack myself. So I tiptoed up the stairs as I thought she must be asleep. And that was when I could hear strange noises. I didn't rush in immediately, and I regret that. although I don't know if it would have made any difference. Then I realized what I could hear, a slight bumping or banging noise. Now, she's only 14. I rushed in there, genuinely thinking I was about to kick some snotty teenage boy and give her a piece of my mind. Because she was totally alone, and that shocked me. Barely conscious, floating above her bed. The bumping and banging was her being sporadically thrown into her wall. The moaning she was making was of being drifting in and out of consciousness, crying out, whimpering in pain. And on the bed, underneath where she seemed to be hovering, was a Ouija board. Not some fancy wooden one either. She made it herself out of a piece of cardboard and Sharpies. I screamed, as if that would somehow stop what was ever happening. Nothing. She didn't even acknowledge I was there. I tried to grip hold of her, pull her down, but whatever force was keeping her up in the air was stronger than me. So I ripped up the cardboard, rushed into the bathroom, and flushed it all down the toilet. I began pleading with it, even though I had no idea what it could be. For a moment, she stopped being bumped, and I thought it had worked, even though she was still floating. But it had just been to mock me. And then her body began being slammed up against the wall, even harder. It tried again to grab hold of her, and this time, I could feel something actually push me too, and I went flying across the room and landed near her dressing table. Heaving myself back up, I caught sight of something in the mirror. I could see a black shadow over by the bed that was only visible in the mirror, so I did the only thing I could think of and smashed it. She came flying back onto the bed and landed. Somehow she hadn't been too badly hurt. She was bleeding a little and bruised, but I was just able to tell my mother that she'd fallen. She could have put up with nightmares like I do, but it was the waking whispers in her ear that have stopped her sleeping, turned her to smoking and drinking, causing my parents great worry. She only sleeps now when she's passed out from sneaking alcohol. Says that the only time he isn't talking to her, telling her to do stuff, telling her all the stuff he wants to do to her, and that her soul now belongs to him. My 14-year-old sister now looks like a crackhead, and it is affecting all of us. Please, if this story just lets one person knows how real this stuff is, I will know I have stopped one more victim, because he will get out. I don't know how, but he will. Even a piece of paper works. I've seen the proof, and I'm living the consequences. If you could offer any advice to help me, I would greatly appreciate it. Thank you. Hey, what lurks beneath? So, even though I don't have my own stories to share with you, a lot of my extended family serves in the forest industry, and they've all shared with me some very terrifying, bizarre, and weird search and rescue stories. I've collected a handful of them, and I thought it would be fun to share them with you. You'll find these scary and interesting. I see that you already have a huge playlist of park ranger stories. While I can't actually verify any of them are true, I can stand and say a lot of these are from my family's own personal experience, since at least 3 or more of them are serving or have served in the industry for quite some time. Starting with my great-grandfather, who served for about 19 or so years before passing away due to an unexpected automobile accident. At the time, he was one of the main leaders of the search and rescue expeditions, and while many of the expeditions turned out normal, and they actually found survivors, there were a few times they found things that didn't quite fit this realm of normalcy. For example, one time, a woman had been reported missing. They found her about 9 miles outside of where she was last seen, except when they found her, they only found her lower half, exactly from her waist down to her feet. Everything left intact. Shoes on, pants on, everything was as normal. But she was cut in half, it appeared, by something surgical, is what they described. Blood had been clotted and coagulated. There was no extra mess, no guts, nothing. It's as if she had been taken and surgically cut in half with a laser, they said. Although the wound never appeared to be burnt or singed in any way, they found it weird that there was no bleeding out or any such sort. They never found her upper half, and again, no sign of roughhousing, no sign of foul play. Her pants were never stained with blood or ripped. It's as if she just fell in half, and her upper half just disappeared. What's weird is they found her up against the base of a small mountain, out in the middle of nowhere. She had been there for probably 2 to 3 days, and another very weird trait is that there had been no onset of putrefaction or death. There was no stench, nor were there any signs of bacteria growing on her that would indicate the buildup of gases or the start of decomposition. This also happened again about 2 years later when they found a young man who was about 15 years old who had died under mysterious circumstances. He was last seen around a trail, disappeared. They found him 3 days later, stripped completely naked, hurtled and huddled by a rock, having died due to exposure. Only thing is, the same concept. There was no onset of putrefaction or decomposition, and he wasn't mummified or frozen. His body was actually around 60 degrees temperature. There's no quite explanation for what happened. They're not sure if he got lost, ripped off his clothes and froze to death. Either way, just strange things. And the last story from my great-grandfather. This older man had also turned up missing. We're talking old, like 70, 80 years old. I don't exactly recollect if he was senile or not, but either way, he had gone missing. Well, search and rescue continued to look for up to 5 or 6 days, if I'm recalling correctly. Well, they never found a trace of him, but they found all of his clothes, his long johns, his underwear, his shirt, his pants, everything, in a pile, tattered and ripped up. No dirt, no blood, no signs of anything other than his clothes had just been clearly taken off and ripped up, by hand it appeared. Nobody's exactly sure what happened. They were searching for prints or any other evidence, and none had been found. The odd thing about this one was, all of his tattered clothes were found in a neat pile in the middle of a small clearing, about 7 miles from where he was found, north over a large ridge and through a small mountain and dense forest, somewhere he never would be able to get to by himself. Just strange things like that make you think and stay up at night, wondering, what if? Now, moving down the family line, my grandfather also served in honor of his father. He too had bizarre and similar circumstances to experience. While he never led search and rescue expeditions or found people's lower halves missing, what he did find or experience was equally disturbing. On several accounts, as he was doing his rounds, he would always claim that he felt like he was being stalked or hunted by something or by multiple things, if that makes any sense to you at all. He said there were certain parts of the park and the forest that he just could not go into, because this strong, overwhelming feeling and sensation of utter and complete doom. On other such occasions, he had had rocks pelted at him, logs thrown in his direction from downhill, things like that, screaming, wood knocking, all sorts of bizarre stuff he couldn't rationalize, and his scariest sighting being as he was driving, on his left, in a clearing, he saw these 2 large black figures walking off in the distance on a hill, right along the tree line. He pulled out his binoculars and looked, and he told me he could never make out details because they were so dark, so incredibly black, but assumed that they had dark fur from head to toe, and that they were walking like large giant men. 2 of them following, all the way riding the tree line, to where when they reached the end, they casually walked in the woods. I believe at this time, this was before Bigfoot, so a sighting like this didn't really have any answers to my knowledge. Either way, it freaked him out, and by far, the most disturbing is when an incident happened very close to the main base, or the main area of a park. I don't really know what they call it. Home base, the main office, so excuse me for my incorrect terminology. But apparently, a man had had his arm ripped off, and luckily was found before he ultimately bled out. How he was found in time, I'm not exactly sure, but from what I understand is he was close enough that he was luckily discovered by other colleagues. Well, he was unconscious already due to blood loss, and if I'm recalling correctly, nearly died. But once he got blood in him, and they were able to resuscitate him, he claimed that he was attacked by what he calls a large bear man, and he said that this bear man tried to attack him, grabbed him, and pulled his arm off, and said that this bear man had such great strength that for it was like ripping up a piece of paper. Effortless. The only details he can give is that it was tall, covered in hair, had really big hands and feet, and a very ugly, scary-looking face. That's all the details my grandfather was able to extract from the man. He ended up living, but that's about as far as I know of that story. This all took place in the 60s and 70s from what I can recall. Then, one of my cousins also pursued the park ranger industry, and he too had his own fair share of weird, bizarre, disturbing experiences. Now, my cousin has had the most experiences, in my opinion, or at least has had the most amount of stories to share. And even though he didn't deal with quite the things my grandfather and great-grandfather dealt with, his own experiences are just as equally disturbing as the other two. His, though, involve a whole different realm of seeing lights, hearing strange noises, feeling sensations, and other such things. And these have also occurred over the course of years. One experience that he recalls to me that's always shaken him is when they were in the middle of doing a search and rescue expedition during the nighttime. The small team he was working with was equipped with lots of lighting gear, flashlights, headlamps, extra batteries, things professionals would use to find their way around in the dark, with always bringing up backups. Well, instantaneously, everybody's flashlights, headlamps, just exploded. I'm talking glass and plastic shattering, and the lights going out. Nobody had nothing. They were stranded there in the dark. This all happened instantaneously. Even in the dark, as they were able to fumble around and pull out the backup batteries with what little moonlight they had, all the batteries were dead, including the tons of backup ones they had. This led to them having to stumble around and find their way back about 2 miles into the dark, which was tougher than you might think. Something he has no explanation for, since all of it happened in unison. He believes that it was some sort of magnetic wave, but what could possibly hit them and his team to make that happen? He's not quite sure. Other times when he's been by himself, he'll hear this incredibly loud humming noise, crescendo more and more in volume, and then finally just stop, instantly, as if it never happened. He equates the humming noise to asking me if I've ever been around a loud generator or an air conditioner, just a really loud noise. That's the best way he described it to me personally. He said it sounded like a generator, and it kind of had that electrical humming wire noise. He said it was without a doubt some sort of machinery, but couldn't quite place his finger on it. He said there's no reason that he should have been hearing that out in the middle of the forest. There's no buildings or electrical wiring or machinery anywhere around, so he has no idea what to equate that to. Several other of his park ranger friends have also heard the same noise, randomly, throughout different times of day, in different locations, all across the park, on search expeditions and on not. He's also reported seeing strange flashes of light in the middle of the woods, mainly during evening, dusk, night, and the very early morning hours, just as the sun is setting or rising, or completely dark. It's like a camera flash is the way he describes it, but much, much more brighter and stronger in intensity, and only last a split second. He has no explanation for that one either. It's almost an unnatural brightness is what he described it. There is no camera flash in the world that has that amount of power or intensity. Think of like a really high-end spotlight, and have it flash and fill up an entire area for just a split second. He said that's what he sees, and while he hasn't exactly experienced this next one, many of his colleagues have. They've been out in the woods, and they hear their names being whispered by strange, distorted voices. They can't really pinpoint where the voices are coming from, because they claim, all of them do, that the voices appear to be all around them, above, below, far and close by. And it's not just one voice, it's a series of voices, all different tones, volumes, and pitches, all distorted sounding, whispering their name. This has happened multiple times, and has really creeped my cousin out. Even though it never happened to him, he says he has no explanation for any of these things, so that about covers that. I hope you enjoyed what I've shared with you today, and I'll talk to them more and see if I can't dig up any more stories from either of them. My great-grandfather passed a long time ago, but my grandfather, even though he's still alive and kicking, I'm sure still has a couple stories left. And my cousin, who isn't in the industry anymore, I'm sure still has some stories as well. Parts of my other family are currently serving in the industry too, but as far as I know, they don't have any stories to share with me that I'm aware of. But I'll go prodding around and see what I can't dig up. After all, it doesn't hurt. Anyhow, I hope you've enjoyed these stories, and just know that if you know anybody that does serve in the industry, I guarantee that they've had their fair share of strange happenings. This happened back in the fall of 2015. So, to give you a little bit of backstory, I live in a smaller house out in the countryside, and because electricity is very expensive, at least the PUD around here is, I mainly rely on a wood stove during the wintertime. I mean, hell, it heats the house up a lot more efficiently than electric heaters, and a cord of wood cost me a lot less money. So, luckily for me, my family has a really good connection with a fellow who lives up in the mountains that I go and cut down my own wood every fall and winter. I won't be referring to his actual name in the story, just to protect his identity, so I'll refer to him as Ken. So Ken has been a longtime family friend of ours, and owns about 50 to 60 acres up in the mountains, where he too has a small trailer. Luckily for him, there's a lot of beautiful deer and elk that roam around, and lots of dead trees, which means perfect for cutting up firewood. A lot of the dead trees have been dead for quite some time, usually due to a kind of rot or bacteria, and there's a lot of dead standing trees that still have yet to be cut down. Last time I was up there, which was just about 3 or 4 months ago, there was easily more than 50 last I checked, and I only need a few for wintertime. So, the usual process is, I go up there, take my trusty chainsaw, cut down about 3 or 4, cut the rounds up, load them into my pickup truck, and then I go split them by hand. And there you go. I get a few cords for the winter and I'm set. So this particular fall was not unlike any other. I did the usual. Went up there, went to a dead standing tree, and began my process of felling it. That's when I began hearing strange noises off in the distance, over my chainsaw. I actually had to stop my cutting and look over, because I couldn't quite make out what was going on. It sounded like a screaming match, or some sort of wrestling brawl, between 2 alpha male primal apes. I guess that's the best I can describe it. It sounded loud, and in my line of sight, I could visibly see the trees shaking off in the distance, over a small valley that lay just between me and this ruckus. I was kind of wondering, what animals out here could possibly do that? We're in the middle of nowhere, and there are certainly no zoos anywhere, if not for hundreds of miles, nor are there really much other people, so there's no reason at all why I should be hearing a noise like this, and deers and elk certainly don't make this kind of noise. So I stopped my chainsaw, set it down, and just sat and observed. The screaming and fighting got louder. It sounded like 2 hippopotamuses or 2 gorillas having a massive fight. It was so loud. And whatever they were, whatever animals they were, had to have been big and powerful, because the trees were shaking violently. Although the brush was still too thick from that distance, I could see the tops of the trees shaking violently. This went on for about 5 or 10 minutes, when it stopped just as suddenly as it began. I tried to ignore it, and finished felling this dead standing tree. Once I had it felled, I began cutting off and lopping off the branches, then splitting it into 12-inch rounds. I got about halfway through the tree when the noises started up again, only this time much, much closer to me, and to my right versus directly in front of me. Although this time, it didn't sound like a brawl as much as it did them running through the forest, in my direction. Here, let me paint a better picture for you. Picture a linebacker from a football team. Make him about triple in size, so maybe 13 feet tall. Make him about 6 to 7 feet wide, rippling muscles, an actual giant. Now, make him as thick as steel, and have him barrel through the woods. Now imagine that coming at you, at roughly 20 miles an hour. Even though I couldn't see anything, I could see the trees moving, coming closer to me, and I could certainly hear something big was coming in my direction. I wasn't exactly sure what to think, so I sat there with my chainsaw. My entire body at this point was screaming to leave, but I didn't want to leave without wood, so I put my chainsaw down just in case I needed to bolt, got ready to get in a runner's stance, in case whatever this was showed itself, and continued to pursue me aggressively. But just in that moment, whatever was charging directly at me through the trees took a right turn and bolted off to the right of me again and circled all the way around me in the woods, as if it knew to stay and remain hidden and not come out in the clearing. I could hear this thing coming all the way around me, directly to my right, working its way all the way directly behind me, and then to my left, all the way to my left, and then disappearing and running off further into the woods. There is a large clearing where I was. Even though it was scattered with dead standing trees, it was large enough that if anything were to come through, you would visibly be able to see it. Ken keeps plenty of salt licks around, as to attract deer and elk, and boy, do they come in numbers. I've seen many before, so initially, that's what I thought it was. But the sounds just didn't match up. It didn't sound like hooves. It sounded again like a big gorilla stomping around. Only problem is, up here in North America, we have no wild gorillas of that size or stature out in the wild. And whatever it was intelligent enough to know to stay hidden, that there was a clearing coming up, and it remained to stay just far enough into the woodline where I could not see it. But I could certainly see it, and the trees continued to move, bend, and shake all the way around as it worked its way in a matter of seconds. Another astonishing feat is that the brush that it went through is quite thick. These are small trees densely packed together. I mean, after all, the timber is pretty small, but it's very thick, and to wade through at the speed it did, with that size, must mean it must have considerable power. That was more than enough for me. I just said, okay, I'm done. Quickly loaded the few rounds that I had into my truck, put my chainsaw back. That's when I drove up to Ken's house, knocked on his door, but I guess he had left, and I didn't even notice. So I got in my truck, got out of there. It's about an hour and 20 minutes back to my house. I just salvaged what rounds that I had at the time and split those up. I would come back at a future date. About the next day or so, I gave Ken a phone call and told him that I had an experience up there, and I proceeded to tell him exactly what I just told you. Well, Ken and I have never talked about this topic ever before until this phone call. He got really quiet, and before I even told him, I was paranoid he wasn't going to believe me, think of me as a liar and lose respect. But he quietly told me he knows, that he's seen these things around before on the property. He said there's multiple of them, and they all linger around. In fact, that night, I guess one of them had nearly ripped the door off his trailer, and the other one had left a massive dent as it ran straight into his trailer. They'll also come onto his property, move things around, misplace things, break stuff. One time, they took one of his splitting mauls and broke it in half like it was a toothpick. Mind you, it was a heavy-duty splitting maul, made of metal and steel. How they did that or what they are, I don't exactly know. Over the phone conversation, we never actually discussed what they were, but we discussed there were something, and whatever kind of animals they are, they don't like people coming on the property. The weird thing is, I've been going up there for years, and have never had an experience like that until that fall. The falls following after that, they remained more quiet and more elusive, never having another experience like that. Even in fact, up to this year, 2020, when I went back in September, nothing. No sounds, nothing strange happening. It's as if they just disappeared and vanished. Anyhow, I don't have any answers. What could I have experienced? I can't help but think of the idea of a Bigfoot, but I know nothing of Sasquatch and Bigfoot, so I thought I would write this out to you and see if you can answer these questions for me. Not my story, but actually my father's, so I apologize in advance if this isn't very long. This is just my recollection of the story he had told me over the years. He passed away back in 2011 from bone cancer. God rest his soul. Back in the day, we used to live out in Colorado, and he was a pretty rugged mountain man. Hiked, camped, and hunted a lot. Well, he told me as I got older that one time, while tracking down a big buck, he nearly lost his life, as he was almost attacked by something worse than a bear. He fully believed in other things of the forest, like fairies, Bigfoot, and other creatures that aren't supposed to exist. He claims he had personal one-on-one run-ins with each of these creatures at least some point in his life. Now, his story is to me that he had apparently came into the territory of one of these creatures, and that a very aggressive Bigfoot clan sought out to attack him and kill him. Luckily, they only partly injured him and left him alive. Why, he's not exactly sure, but he said they appeared merciful and primarily just wanted him out of their territory. Unfortunately for my father, the buck he was tracking down had come across a portion of their territory in the mountains. He had not known about this at the time. Since entering their territory, they acted extremely hostile towards him, circling him and coming in at him, throwing rocks, pieces of wood, all sorts of stuff, until one of them actually came up to him, grabbed him, and nearly broke his legs. Although he said they didn't, because there was some sort of restraint. Like I said, that he had told me, he believes they were merciful, and they just wanted to instill fear and aggression, and not actually kill him. This obviously left my father very fearful, traumatized for a while. He had a hard time going back into the woods, and his legs were actually injured for quite some time afterwards. He never went into detail what they did to him, or how they injured his legs, but he said they used great strength to hurt him. Even though his legs were not actually broken, they were fractured and splintered in several places along his shin, his knee, and his thigh. I don't know if they grabbed him and squeezed his legs, nor do I know if they used some sort of rock and crushed him. He wouldn't go into detail, probably as to not scare me as a young boy. But after a few months, maybe 5 or so, he was completely better and walking again as normal, and not having this odd limp that he used to have. He also never did track down that buck, since after it went into that territory, he never found it. What he believes is that since that buck came into their territory, they pursued the buck, and then noticed he was also pursuing what they thought was their kill, which is why he was targeted. Although I'm not 100% sure, but my dad isn't a liar, and he's pretty stern and serious about his stories and his tales of hunting and time out in the woods. So I believe him, even though I don't believe in Bigfoot or any of the other stories that surround it. My dad's stories, if he could tell them to you face to face, are pretty terrifying, to say the least. Anyway, I just wanted to send this to you. I thought you might find it interesting. Sorry I can't recall more, but this should be enough to get my point across. My parents own a pretty good chunk of property, large enough to include a small lake. I had been expressly forbidden to never go near the lake without any adult supervision. So, as a kid, you can imagine I was always itching to go near that body of water. That's not there was a lack of water for me to go near. There was actually a pond not that far away, and for whatever reason, there was no problem with me visiting the pond, but there would be fireworks and hell to pay. I had never quite figured out the logic. The simple fact that it was forbidden was that it made it more inviting. As it often happens with many kids, I'm outside, unsupervised, and I got the idea to go take a visit. What my parents didn't know wouldn't hurt them. It wasn't like it was one of those places where you get a bad feeling just by being there. It was a very beautiful pond, and that particular day, the sun was shining, the weather gorgeous, made it all the more inviting. That's when I noticed something that I had never noticed before. A short distance into the lake was what looked like a segment of a pier or a dock, as if there was somebody had taken the pier apart, but failed to get one last segment of it that was out in the water. It was close enough that I would be able to swim to it. I was 11 years old, and I was a capable swimmer. I figured I was old enough to prove that I wasn't in any danger by being in or near the lake. I mean, I wasn't a baby anymore. I took off my clothes, jumped in the water, and I swam over to the small island of planks, being held up by heavy logs that reached far down into the water. I climbed up on the top, sat there, proud of myself, like any 11-year-old is of such a small feat. If only my parents could see me now, I thought. They would realize how grown up I am, and that I'm not just a little boy. My moment of triumph, though, was interrupted by movement next to the lakeshore. I want to say that I saw somebody, but the whole way it carried itself made it something. I mean, it had the overall shape of a man, albeit a very tall one, but there was something about the way it moved that seemed feral, almost like it was wearing clothes of some kind. The face was difficult for me to see. I couldn't see light reflecting off eyes. I couldn't see a nose or mouth. It appeared slightly hunched at the shoulders, making it look like it was skulking, even when it wasn't. It came to the water, and it began to wade out into it. Then the water went up to this thing's neck, and then it completely submerged. That was the last I had seen of it, but for some reason, it had completely scared me out of my wits. I was afraid to even move, let alone breathe. Quite a bit of time passed, and I was beginning to wonder if the thing was ever going to come for me, 'cause it surely would have reached me by then, if I was the reason it got in the water. Plus, my bladder was getting full, and suddenly, I heard angry shouting. My father. He was livid. He was throwing a bright orange raft onto the surface of the water and paddling out to get me. I jumped in the raft, deciding it was better than being in the water where I didn't know where that boogeyman was. My dad, not speaking a word, which is what he does when he is absolutely at his wit's end of anger. I knew I had it in. So, we silently paddled back to shore, and I looked back at the pier, and I thought the color drained from my face as I saw the head of that creature was poking up out of the water, just under the pier. It had been waiting for me the whole time. And in that moment, I understood why I was never allowed near the water. And after that incident, I never went there again, not even in my adult life. I got grounded for a long time after that. and when I asked my dad about it, if he had seen the thing, he wouldn't even acknowledge it, like he knew, but didn't want to bring it into reality. My mother played dumb about it too. Even to this day, I'm well into my 30s, and both refuse to even acknowledge or talk about it. Very strange. I'm from Illinois, and if you are from the same place, then you know that the city I'm in is home to 2 exceptionally large industrial processing plants. They manufacture soy and vitamin E. I don't know if I'm allowed to mention them by name or not. I work at one of those 2 places, and a number of the people in my family do as well, because where else can you get paid that kind of money, not knowing how to do anything? Push a broom, roll a paintbrush, don't get crushed, burned, impaled, or eaten. You don't know about things that can eat you unless you actually work at those places. Think about it. When you have places that separate vitamin E from other nutrients, it's impossible for them to capture all of it. Some of it goes out in the runoff, since it's environmentally safe, because after all, it's just food and vitamins. Well, unbeknownst to the casual outsider, there are rats and catfish that have nothing to do all day but eat that same runoff. They have no predators inside the facilities. So what do you think is going to happen to an animal that has no need to take shelter from predators and an endless supply of nutrient-densely packed food? They're going to increase in size. If this story makes it on air, I wholeheartedly challenge your listeners to fact-check the same story. My dad worked at one of these facilities before I did. He said that he and 3 of his coworkers were down by one of the lagoons when one of them accidentally dropped a torch in the water. As deep as their pockets are, you don't just go losing expensive equipment like that. Not if you're planning on a long-term career. The guilty part waded out into the water and found that it was deeper than he expected. Now you can imagine how foul the water must be, considering the state of the air when you go over the bridge over the entire facility. My dad's coworker was facing the prospect of having to go under the water to get the torch. Here's where everything happened quickly. The guy steeled himself, held his breath, went underwater. My dad glimpsed something dark and slick and shiny, with a long fin on its back, crest the water for just a moment. There was a brief disturbance in the water, and then it was over with. The guy never came back up. Dad and the other guy raised hell over it. But this is a corporation with incredibly deep pockets, which is why it's very dangerous to work here. There is no fine steep enough to force them into implementing any major safety programs. When something happens to one of their workers, they just reach into said deep pockets, pay off any fines or lawsuits, or anything else, and they bring in another warm body from the stack of applications of people who want to make decent money with literal no experience. I know that sounds like a bad plot to a science fiction movie, but honestly, it's the cold hard truth. They covered over the missing man's grave with money, just like they do with everyone else that suddenly isn't there anymore. My dad also swears up and down that for years afterwards, if he paid close enough attention, he would see a catfish the size of a shark in the lagoon. He never saw it completely exposed, but he always saw parts of it, or evidence of its presence. And it wasn't exactly small. Encounters with rats, the size of large cats, are a common experience out there. So it's not far-fetched to say there's one, if not more, catfish that are more than capable of swallowing a grown man. If you don't believe me, you are more than welcome to come out here and see for yourself. I lived in a small town that had a lake at the very edge of it. The lake was just about as big as the town. That either says something about how small the town was, or how big the lake was. Anyway, by the time I was 13 years old, I had a girlfriend that I spent just about every spare minute with that I could. My parents were more on the strict side, so they frowned on me spending any time with my girlfriend alone. After all, we never got into any real trouble. Any time that we actually had alone time, it was out in public. An expedition to the mysterious lake at the edge of town was just the right excuse to go for a nice long walk with my girlfriend and our chaperone, Dell, the border collie. We kept our eyes out for any signs that would say something like no trespassing or private property. But we didn't see anything. We didn't have any reservations about exploring. The waters are pretty still, with the exception of fish that would dart away when they see you. One of them was an exception. It lay there in the shallow waters, thrashing. It got my curiosity up, and I wondered if it was injured. It didn't look like any fish that I was used to seeing. It seemed to have a long body, and a peculiar pinkish blue color with shallow veins. Even in the daylight, I could tell that it had a few highlights of bioluminescence. I looked to see if maybe it was wrestling with some kind of parasite that had latched itself onto it, asking my girlfriend to find a stick so I could try to help it along. But it was when my girlfriend actually approached with the stick that Dell suddenly went berserk, and she put herself between us and this thrashing fish. She barked at it with all the fury I had never seen in her before. I tried to edge past her, but she refused to let me in. She even began lunging at this strange fish in the water, as if she were trying to intimidate it going away, which of course it wasn't. Then, she couldn't help herself. She attacked it. The minute she connected with it, something I can only describe as a giant leech coming up out of the water and totally enveloping my dog whole. The muscles on its body began crushing my dog, and the disturbing, traumatic sound of crunching bones, along with her muffled whimpers under this thing's flesh, crushing my sanity along with her body. The thrashing fish must have had some kind of organ that performed a similar function to that of an angler's fish lure. Look, it's hard for me to talk about. Part of me died that day. I had never seen or heard anything more horrible than what that thing had done to my dog before in my life. It's still something I don't really like to dwell on. My dog died a horrible death, and I had to see it. It was like watching something out of a horror movie, except this wasn't a horror movie. This was real life.